Microsoft is currently developing their own in-house LLM. This is huge news because obviously they've been very tied to OpenAI for the last, the last year and a half. They've been going with ChatGPT. And so this marks a really big move for them. There is all sorts of speculation. People are saying, well, maybe they're, worried about having to break up with OpenAI. And, in the case of AGI, this is kind of the contract. Or maybe, they're just trying to hedge their bets or trying to build something else. And people are talking about what OpenAI's opinion on this is, if they're offended. I mean, virtually they own OpenAI, so it's kind of tricky. And they just bought the entire Inflection team that's leading this. So much is going on. Connor, what are your thoughts on Microsoft building their very own ChatGPT competitor?
This feels like big news to me. And listen, here's the thing that, I've seen people say, and a lot of people quoting, I think it was the CTO of Microsoft saying, why is this getting press? This is such not a big deal. This happens all the time. We build products, they build products. Jaden, I am not buying that at all. And I'm not trying to sort of like sensationalize this or anything like that. But they have an amazing partnership. And Microsoft didn't hire Mustafa Suleyman from Inflection. Can't even imagine what they're paying that guy to just sit around. So they're doing that. And I think it's really for the reasons that you started to touch on, right? I mean, like Microsoft has used OpenAI to really get their product out there. They've infused it into Copilot, which is probably the biggest thing, but also like Bing and everything else. You know what I mean? Like they've really leveraged, it's been a phenomenal partnership. And I think that it will be a continued phenomenal partnership. But just like Apple, Microsoft is big enough where they need to own their supply chain. It does not make any sense for a company like that large not to own it. I mean, Google sort of like owns their whole supply chain going down. That's why Apple has to be building good LLMs. It wouldn't make any sense not to, because they can't. And the same with Microsoft. So for the reasons that you say, and I just want to kind of touch on them all briefly. Number one is that it's just better to own your own thing and not be so reliant on one. This is a single source of failure or a single point of failure for Microsoft at this moment, as we saw back in November when Sam Altman got ousted. Microsoft found out, I think, something like 45 minutes before that happened. And they're like, everything is built on OpenAI, and now there's no OpenAI. What's happening here? So there's that, of course. So you want to sort of like own your supply chain. And also, I'm just thinking that the other thing that you mentioned about AGI, and again, I always want to reiterate this. We've mentioned it before on the podcast, but OpenAI has openly, in its terms, stated with its partnership with Microsoft, that when OpenAI reaches AGI, and we can have a whole conversation about that, Microsoft will essentially not be able to profit from it. It's, and this feels like a sort of a term and condition that was made before we realized how close we were to AGI. It kind of feels like, again, like Disney and Mickey Mouse being like, oh, it's 100 years away. Like, sure, give us a copy for 100 years. And all of a sudden 100 years rolls around, they're like, oh no, right? And that's kind of how I see this. Like Microsoft has to hedge, and Google doesn't have this problem, and Grok doesn't have this problem. Anthropic has this problem in a big, big way. But when they hit AGI, it's not necessarily a moment of celebration, because they have sort of like all pledged to basically hand it over to regulators in some kind of way, shape, or form. And Microsoft cannot build this entire ecosystem, and then if they hit AGI and somehow it gets declared this is AGI, to all of a sudden not be able to profit from it is insanity. That's sort of like, again, so when they say it's not a big deal, I think this is a huge deal.
Yeah, no, 100%. This makes perfect sense. It always feels like your deadlines are so much further away. You have like Hong Kong, yes. Which, was bought by the British from China, and they had a 100-year lease on it, and it seemed like it would never end. And then, eventually like the lease ends, it goes back to China, and then it's going to, and you just see like the growing pains in that transition where it felt like, oh, well, Hong Kong's going to be its own autonomous thing. And then, eventually kind of just gets like wrangled into Chinese rule. But anyways, that's another conversation. It's going to be the same thing with Microsoft, though. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing of Microsoft either, right? They're like, you could say they're leasing OpenAI for however many years till it gets to its super high thing. But that doesn't mean that that's like their only bet. They're obviously going to need to start building their own thing to pass the torch on. And you can see this was actually a genius play by Microsoft. My assumption is Sam Altman goes in to the C Corps or the C-suite at Microsoft and is like, hey, we'd love to do something. This is what we have. What can we do? Microsoft sees how far ahead they are, and I actually think they had a couple of thoughts. Number one was, yeah, like how can we benefit this in our technology and our company, but also what happens if OpenAI goes over to Google or Apple and makes a similar deal, right? So I think this was a fantastic move by Microsoft. I don't ever think that OpenAI was the end game for them. I think grab this and leverage it. Look at the Microsoft stock over the last year. Look at how much Microsoft has embedded into every product and how much they boosted themselves, but they know this is unreliable. They essentially took like this super shiny object that was a jetpack and they launched onto it. And you can see like what happened. Google didn't do that. Google tried to do it all in-house and Google's way far behind them, right? They also had this kind of shield where it's like any criticism goes to OpenAI and that's just a small startup and so small startups can take the criticism. It's not, Microsoft's not held to the same standard necessarily of everything that's going on. And so I think that this was a genius move. They could be on the cutting edge. They could propel their company to the absolute maximum while taking the lowest liability. But this is not a sustainable strategy. It's kind of like it gets them a leg up and a boost, but it doesn't keep them in the lead for long. And so, yeah, at this point, they need to start developing their own model. This new model they're making is 500 billion parameters. It's massive. It's going to be, they're aiming to be best in class with Google and Anthropic and OpenAI. So this thing's going to be like a really solid product. I'm excited to see kind of what they build here, but it's kind of a no-brainer on why this is all happening.
No, I think that's true. And I have another sort of, it's not a conspiracy theory, but it's just a theory, which is, I think that, okay, walk with me on this theory for a second, Jaden. So imagine sort of like everybody sitting in front of Congress, all the Facebook, and, all the social media people, right? They're getting crushed. Like they don't have public sentiment on their side, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then you had all the Sam Altmans and Dario Amadeus and everybody else up there, and everybody just seemed to love them. Do you know what I mean? Like, and people are still on their side. And that's because they've been talking about safety kind of from the beginning, right? And I just feel like we're getting closer and closer to these conversations around regulation around, both in Europe and the US. And I'm starting to think that this may be slightly a political play. I may be wrong about this, but Anthropic has that sort of sewn up, right? They're like, hey, we are the safety one. We have this long-term benefit trust that oversees our board, which, by the way, OpenAI had, and it blew them up. So that's my own sort of ticking time bomb Anthropic I shout about all the time. But more importantly, like I think public sentiment, and especially the sentiment of the regulators, i.e. the politicians of this country and other countries, it really, really matters. Nobody knows anything. There's no sort of like one single metric like, oh, here's how we're going to measure this. And my thought is that it's really going to sort of like just depend on like, do these regulators kind of like OpenAI? Do they like Microsoft? Do they like Meta? The answer on that one obviously is like, no, they don't like Elon and they don't like Zuckerberg, which is why they didn't invite them to these, regulatory councils by the Department of Homeland Security, all that kind of stuff. That stuff really, really matters to be in the room, right? And my thought on this is that Satya Nadella, and I might be wrong, but Satya Nadella is like, listen, if safety guy number 2 after Dario Amadeus at Anthropic was Mustafa Suleyman. Like, yes, he did DeepMind, all that kind of stuff. But then he wrote the book, The Coming Wave, saying like, guys, we have to be really, really careful here. Like, and they did Inflection, and that was supposed to be like super safe and everything like that. And if they can say like, look, we hired the safety guy, like we're building this new model, this MAI-1 to be super safe, which look, ChatGPT seems pretty safe and we like it, but do you know what I mean? Like, I just feel like this is coming. And I feel like if they can position themselves as the other safety alternative to Anthropic, that's going to have a huge implication of like whether this thing gets regulated or not.
Yeah, that's so interesting. That's a fantastic point. What is beyond just hedging against the inevitable OpenAI moving out, but also who they pick to do that hedge. So Mustafa Suleyman's a really interesting person. Whatever. I have my own beefs with him, but maybe he's solved his problems at Inflection. Anyways, I'll bring that up to the day I die. But anyways, I think this is interesting. One thing that they have said though is their new model is not based on Inflection. I think they have to make that clear from an investor IP standpoint. The employees are not bringing over anything to do with Inflection into this new system. Not that I think it matters because essentially the talent's been gutted and they're turning it over to the old CEO of Mozilla Firefox, which whatever. So anyways, I think it's going to be interesting to see where that goes. I'm also curious to see what happens to Inflection. What I would love, okay, let me just paint you my perfect picture, my fantasy of the AI landscape shifting would be Mustafa Suleyman goes over to Microsoft. They start building this thing. They got a lot of money. It's going to be whatever. I would love Inflection to get their humanity issues fixed, and then Inflection to just become this massive thing that neither Microsoft nor Mustafa Suleyman are in control of anymore, and it becomes a major model. That would be beautiful to me. I don't know if that will happen. Microsoft inevitably is going to be a huge player in the space. My second thing that I think would be amazing to happen is actually if AGI arrives, Sam Altman breaks up with Microsoft, and I think Sam Altman has the ability to fly and be his own legendary person. Like, he is a legendary person, but like when 50% of your company is owned by Microsoft, like, you have some level of being under the thumb of the big corporation. You know what I mean? And I know they're all like, no, they're like totally autonomous and they can do whatever they want. We have all these special rules, but like, you know who feeds you. And if you get 50% of your funding from one source and they own 50% of your company, it's rough. So I think it'd be epic to see Inflection fly free, and then to see Sam Altman fly free and see what he could do with AGI or whatever new technologies they come out with, not being constrained under, Microsoft. It'll be interesting to see what happens. We got another 5-10 years for, I think, Sam Altman to really spin that out if he decides to. And I think he could build something pretty impressive. So that's what I'm excited about.
No question. I love this. I love that you were like just dropping bombs and be like, maybe next time. And then like on my deathbed, like that's exactly what I want from Jayden every week here. Guys, thank you so much for listening. Continue this conversation online with us. Jayden is all over LinkedIn. He's starting to drop videos on LinkedIn. They're absolutely fantastic. You got to check them out. And otherwise, listen, if you have time, if you have a moment and you appreciate sort of like listening to this podcast, we would love it if you left a rating and review. Today is the day. We so appreciate you guys. We do this because we love it. And otherwise, have an amazing rest of your day.